Let's explore the roles, the ego block. Okay, so the first row of Model A 1 and 2 is called the ego block. Functions describe aspects of reality that a person perceives with the greatest depth and clarity and verbalizes with the greatest ease. Can't help spontaneously commenting on and is comfortable discussing out loud. Require a constant stream of new information and stimulation. Describes a person's preferred and most comfortable natural role. Ego functions are mostly indifferent to praise. That's true, since it's very hard to tell a person something about these aspects that they didn't already know. Yeah. That's so funny. Okay, so leading function, also called the base of the program, simply the first function, most dominant psychic function. So that's my introverted intuition. General terms, the person's most comfortable thinking patterns, perspective on life, state of mind, perceives, processes, produces information most intensively. Oh, interesting. When a person speaks or acts from their leading function, they convey a sense of robust confidence and often begin to speak categorically, persuasively, or using exaggerations. I think it's a little bit harder to see with introverted intuition, though, since it's such a internal, I have to express it through the extroverted thinking. Creative function. So the creative describes the primary mode of application, which is my TE, extroverted thinking. What's in it for me? What do I want to be? How do I make contact with other people? For introverts, creating a product worthy of being included in interaction. That sounds sad. Okay, people using their creative function less than their base and attach less personal significance to it. Although due to the nature of blocked functions, it is usually used in tandem with the base function. Yes, my NITE is inseparable. When other people try to make this function the main criterion for everything, light irritation can arise, and the person may try to correct the other person's emphasis by presenting a perspective from his base function and suggesting that this is more important. Yeah, okay. This is the critique of an INTJ on an ENTJ, right? Because ENTJs, they are headlong reckless into their opinions and their decision making and their take on things. Their logical sort of like movement towards action can seem a little reckless. I feel like to the INTJ, who's like, okay, you're jumping to your conclusions a little bit too fast. Yeah, maybe it's effective, maybe it's a fine leadership style, but maybe let's take a beat. I mean, I mostly agree with what the ENTJ does for the most part, and I admire a lot of it. But yeah, that slight irritation at the extroverted thinking being too promoted. Yeah, that is fascinating. When people get to use their creative function to help others' problems, they feel needed and fulfilled and begin to live more fully. I think that's true. Using the creative function is frequent and effortless, seems to turn on and off fairly easily, might seem highly interested in this aspect and the next totally indifferent. Interesting. May jar people who it's more of their reality. Interesting. Okay, so that's NITE, and that's considered the ego block. Okay, the super ego block. So functions 3 and 4 are actually the super ego block. Interesting, because introverted sensing is 8th in the Dr. John Beebe model, which is based off of the Myers-Briggs system of the Jungian cognitive functions. But here it's 3rd, it's in a role position. The individual's free and spontaneous use of the ego block functions implies limitations on the use of these functions. They are the rejected alternative to the ego block. When a person's own interests are not sufficiently developed and people around him pressure him to be more competent with his superego functions, distress and disappointment results. Cannot channel energy through the superego long enough to obtain lasting results, which leads to disappointment, guilt, and even neuroses. Source of self-consciousness when amongst strangers or critical onlookers. Okay, people become aware of the inadequacy. Yeah, interesting. Prone to inflexibility. tend to reject new information unless it comes from firsthand experience or respected sources. Criticism of these aspects can produce long-lasting animosity. Be aware of that. It may become defensive or close up and ruminate about the situation for days. Oh, interesting. Outright praise can be a self-esteem boost. Huh, maybe. Okay, so this is my introverted sensing. This is what I am rejecting in favor of introverted intuition. The role function is turned off when so SI is off when I'm using my introverted intuition. They can't be on at the same time because they represent two opposing approaches to similar things. Because of this opposition, the more one gets carried away with one's base function, the more the role function is ignored or suppressed. People are generally aware of this suppression. Yeah, perceive it as a personal weakness that needs to be worked on. Yeah. In order to correct imbalances in their life and improve their weak areas, absolutely. Yeah. I know that introverted sensing is something I need to work on. Yeah. Attempts are generally sporadic and are forgotten as soon as the perceived problem begins to go away. That is so true. Yikes. When people are criticized for the lack of attentiveness to their role function, they often become irritated because they're already well aware of the deficiency and have tried and failed to correct it. Yes. When problems arise, energy flows away from the base function, usual activities come to a halt, and you try to pick up all the tasks you've been neglecting. Yeah. So this is like, for introverted sensing, it has to deal with health, I feel like, a lot of the times. Routine and maintenance type of things, the details of the sensory environment. Compared to the vulnerable function, role function, criticism is easier for a person to respond to or dismiss because we're aware of the problem, right? In theory. Okay, the vulnerable function is my extroverted feeling. Extroverted feeling in the 8-function model, based on Myers-Briggs, Dr. John Beebe, in that model, it would be my 7th, which is often called the trickster, the blind spot, the double blind, is very similar to the vulnerable function here. Oh, polar. I've heard of this. The vulnerable function is also called the polar, the point or place of least resistance, or it's a very sensitive function. The element in this function creates a feeling of frustration and inadequacy. A person does not understand the importance of this element entirely, and it can lead to painful consequences. However, to directly engage this function creates feelings of insecurity or distress. One reason why the vulnerable function is difficult to engage is because 3 other conscious functions come before it, making this one more difficult to comprehend. Often, an alternative approach may be found from the view of the mobilizing function, which for me is introverted feeling, so I can circumnavigate extroverted feeling by relying on my introverted feeling, which is something I have adopted, and I have to do it that way. Psychological disincentives to using the vulnerable function. People usually try to ignore information related to it. I'm trying not to turn away from it. I'm trying not to be overly sensitive to it. Even with a theoretical understanding of how it works, it's difficult to turn it into practical norms of behavior, yes. One can develop the vulnerable function by recognizing that it is actually important in certain real-life circumstances. Yes, I do recognize it's important. Extroverted feeling is important, I just don't think I'm good at it. Or I kind of think I can't do it. I have to, like, circumnavigate it. Will try to avoid taking responsibility for it himself, develop a minimalist or non-traditional approach. Non-traditional approach for me. Using other functions, yes. Here we go. A type with FE polar does not see the point of activities revolving around excessive displays of emotion or behavior that does not reach a concrete or tangible outcome. Yeah, kinda. That's kind of my stance on it. They would rather keep conversations serious and to the point. That's not necessarily true. I like exploring ideas. Overwhelmed by emotional expression. Not necessarily overwhelmed by emotional expression. I just can't produce it within myself. Making it quite difficult to express themselves. Okay, yes. Social interactions, they will make a serious effort to reduce their level of emotive expressiveness. So now that I've realized this is a weakness, I actually try to heighten my emotional expressiveness, which still doesn't really raise the bar very much. Showing that you're too joyful or sad can make you vulnerable to the influence of others. Huh. Yeah, maybe. Maybe not, though. Not really. I don't know if I agree with that. Don't hold a high standard for how people as a group feel about things. Yeah, I don't. I don't like groupthink at all. Instead, value situations where they can speak their own subjective opinions and feelings freely. Yes. So they're describing the different polars. Luckily, mine was first. Okay, 5 and 6 is the super id block. The subject will appreciate direct help. Interesting, I do find that to be true. Sees tasks related to it as chores best left to others. Yeah, willing to outsource. Source of frequent recreation. Subject will try to use the super id functions, but with limited effect, as it often comes off as overkill, usually poorly developed. Yeah. Only in the presence of complementary types can an individual let loose the childlike super id without fear of criticism. Yeah. Ironically, although these types will maintain a good deal of their super id information in the atmosphere, they will at the same time doggedly encourage to keep using the ego functions. Okay, which ends up being the healthiest thing either way. Suggestive, so this is extroverted sensing. The dual seeking function. Difficult to be overwhelmed. The more it is present in daily life, the more naturally adapt to its presence. Okay, so I mean, it's indication that you should try to keep it in your life, right? Easily entertained by this kind of information. Yeah. Oh, I love beautiful things. The sublime in a literary sense. Sustained by presence creates a soothing psychological effect. If someone experiences a deficiency of it in his environment, may attempt to supply himself, but soon become exhausted. Concentrated and prolonged doses from other people are received positively, depending somewhat on the individual's degree of dualization. Interesting. It allows them to be more understanding or satisfied about the pursuits within the ego, so the NIT. So that's a very useful way to look at extroverted sensing. It's a very positive way. I kind of see extroverted sensing for me as having a dual role, right? Like it is poorly developed, so it's a source of insecurity for me and a lack of familiarity, right? And it does look probably very childish if I try to do something athletic. But I also really admire performers, like actors, improvisers, people who are athletically gifted. I don't like to follow sports, but if you sit me down in front of a television while sports are playing, I'm like really enamored with the professionals and their skill. I love beautiful people and beautiful art, beautiful nature. Yeah, for sure. Mobilizing function, my introverted feeling. Also called the activating the hidden agenda function. Oh boy, it has some connotation on it. Help in this element is appreciated, but past a certain point is seen as excessive. Interesting. More comfortable using this function than the suggestive, but can still only use it sporadically. If he isn't careful and directs it at an individual who does not value it, he will likely meet a harsh response. Yeah, that's why I'm protective of my introverted feeling, right? To me, it's very vulnerable. The subject's innate lack of balance in the mobilizing function can easily cause him to indulge in it recklessly or to sorely neglect it. Interesting. It is best used to support of the suggestive function. I find that to be true. So if I think about introverted feeling as like my intense interest in various things, like my introverted feeling and my extroverted sensing pair really well together in my hobbies, my hobby interests. All of my hobbies are FISE because it's like an individual interest that I'm pursuing through kind of the aesthetic or the physical. If too much of this element is ambient, the person will get bored or even become repelled. Interesting. Sees it as a necessary part of good living, but not a primary life goal. Okay, the id block. People see id elements as relatively easy, if somewhat boring and meaningless exercise, good for sharpening one's skills, but not worth focusing on too much. Interesting. Ignoring function. The ignoring function is also called the observing or limiting function. A person has very little use of this element as it is the rival image of the base function. So yeah, it's the opposite of introverted intuition, extroverted intuition, representing an antithetical approach to the same domain. Yeah, but I almost see it as like NI's other half, you know? Like it does something similar but very differently. So it's like, can we meet in the middle and kind of like have some fun? It lies in the subconscious as a persistent annoyance to the individual. I have a more positive outlook to it. Therefore, he or she tries to ignore it. When lectured by another on the use of ignoring function, the individual sees it as superfluous information. For he or she knows how to use the function well, but chooses not to use it in favor of his or her more convenient base function. That's more of my attitude. Yes. Okay, so I see extroverted intuition. I see what it's doing, and I actually do admire it. But it's a little cray cray. We can all admit that extroverted intuition is a little cray cray. And I love them for it. Anyone who has extroverted intuition, even in their lowest part, love it. But it's like I am choosing the other path. I am choosing the antithesis. At this point, kind of intentionally. No, but I don't think it's necessarily only intentionally because I cannot reproduce what extroverted intuition does. You know, maybe something genetically or something in my brain wiring in childhood put me in this path of introverted intuition, and I can see extroverted intuition, but I can't reproduce that. I wish I could. Watch me try to become an ENTP. Usually the base function creates byproducts relating to the ignoring function. It does. Yeah. Because I see possibilities and I am sometimes open to those. I'm sometimes open to those possibilities, but I limit it down through my observation. I come to a conclusion and I assign probability to possibility, and then I move forward. So that's interesting. A person limits the expression of this element in public in favor of the base function, but sometimes uses it extensively in private and can call upon it when necessary. I just don't think I'm doing extroverted intuition. I think it's still my base function. Extreme avoidance can make it appear weak. However, when engaged, it does not cause the same kind of psychological stress as a weak function, instead creating kind of a boredom or malaise. I don't know. I always have fun with extroverted intuition, but I think extroverted intuition is just such a fun function. I think inherently it's just fun. But maybe some people don't think that. I mean, especially if it's an insecurity for some people. Okay, demonstrative is, what is it? Oh, for me it's TI. Demonstrative, introverted logic. Okay. A person uses this element mainly as a kind of game or to ridicule those who he thinks takes it too seriously. Yeah. How? Oh, that's so rude. That's so rude of me to do. Yeah. Ooh. I'm learning something about myself here. They often intentionally go against its conventional usage simply to prove a point in favor of their creative function. Oh my gosh, I have an example of this. Okay, like I said before, my romantic partner, he is an INTP. He has introverted thinking first in his function as his base function, right? So one thing, sometimes I will just kind of, turtles all the way down sort of logic into absurdity, and we will pose hypotheticals, or he's interested in exploring a hypothetical, which is where introverted intuition lives, hypothetical land. So he's interested in posing a hypothetical to me because he wants to see how I'll respond to it. And what I do is I pick apart the hypothetical because I treat it as reality, and I start asking questions. I ask very pointed questions in order to develop a logic around the hypothetical. And it's just a very fun exercise, and he gets a little frustrated or a little flustered because he's like, I just proposed a hypothetical and you completely shredded it and tore it apart. And I was like, I was taking that shit seriously. But yes, TE comes off as the critic of TI, and TI comes off as the critic of TE. But they can still work together. I think especially if you have a strong attachment to the person who is using the other function, then you can really work together. However, this function is used quite often in private to produce information of its element to support their creative function when focusing on making contact with the external world. A person will often have just as sophisticated an understanding of this function as his or her leading function. Unlike the ignoring function, it plays a major role in their worldview. When a person is given information regarding the element in the demonstrative function by someone else, they will tend to take it as obvious information that is irrelevant to completely focus on. That's a little bit rough for my relationship. My partner will say something from the TI perspective, and I'm like, yeah, isn't that just obvious? And it's gotta be really dismissive and frustrating to him, right? Isn't that just obvious? We shouldn't focus on that. That's obvious. So when you're in a romantic relationship, you gotta be very careful of the things of which you are dismissive. If you're dismissive of things that your partner cares about, it's gonna be like you're rejecting them or you're dismissing them. So be careful. That's my relationship advice. Why am I giving relationship advice? I don't know. Should you take relationship advice from an INTJ? We are good advisors. Maybe, maybe not. I think yes. I think you should take relationship advice from an INTJ. One will often use the demonstrative function to defend or further support their beliefs made in the vulnerable function. My vulnerable function is extroverted feeling. So that makes sense, because TI is partnered with FE. So it would make sense if I would be trying to tap into logic in order to defend my circumnavigation of extroverted feeling. Yeah, I don't know. The demonstrative function is the easiest function to use after the base function, yet often occurs sporadically. When one experiences a problem regarding this function, one must correct it, as it does play a vital part in a person's worldview. Well, it's interesting to take a complete divergent path away from the Myers-Briggs models and how they developed this theory. Because if I'm reading this the way it's being said, it's like, hey, actually, my use of introverted thinking is pretty good. Interesting, because I have had this issue. In the Myers-Briggs system, I'm like, well, what the heck is the difference between TI and NI? Because TI, when other people describe it, I'm like, that's kind of my NITE. My NITE together creates TI in a weird sort of roundabout way. And so maybe Socionics is picking that out. And they're saying, no, actually, you're using TI, but it's kind of sporadic and it's serving the purposes of your NI. So you don't really think of it as its own distinct thing because it's informing your introverted intuition so much. That's an interesting stance to take. I don't know. I don't know if I agree with it. So I'm going to end this here. I'm going to start a different video. Yeah, I'll start a different video where I go into the actual functions here.